Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 108. Today's guests are Rachel Zucker, Dujie Tahat, and David Naimon. Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the show. So, how are you holding up so far? I hope that wherever you are, whatever you're up to, that you're getting what you need and that you're staying safe and healthy. We're doing something a little different today. Instead of the one-on-one conversations you're used to hearing here, we're doing a panel. See, last month at the annual AWP Conference, I was supposed to be moderating a panel called The Craft of the Literary Podcast Interview with Rachel Zucker of Commonplace, Dujie Tahat of the Poet Salon, and David Naimon of Between the Covers, three of my favorite literary podcasts. And I was really excited for it. Had been planning the panel for months, but then, of course, coronavirus. So we canceled the panel and stayed home, and that was hugely disappointing, but it was the right thing to do. Still, I couldn't help thinking that we would have had a great conversation at that panel. And then Rachel hit on the idea of turning it into a remote panel and recording it as a podcast episode instead, which all four of us are experienced podcasters, so it made a lot of sense. And, well, here we are. Between the four of us, Rachel, Dujie, David, and I have talked with hundreds of writers for our shows, and each of us has our own style and focus, so it was great getting the chance to pick their brains about how they think about the interview, how they go about crafting their shows, and creating space for excellent conversations to happen. Now, I've put links in the show notes to each of my guests' shows, and if you're not already listening to them, I highly recommend it. These are some of my favorite shows and are staples of my podcast listening, and conveniently, I've put in links to all of the episodes we mentioned during the panel as well, so if you need a place to start, look no further. Okay, let's get started. Here's our panel on the craft of the literary podcast interview. Sort of the reason that I wanted to do this panel is because, when I was starting out, I really had no formal training in how to conduct an interview, and I pretty much had to figure everything out by myself on my own, sort of on-the-job training kind of thing. A lot of what I ended up learning in terms of interview techniques, different sort of best practices, and little tricks of the trade kind of thing, it all came to me from listening to other shows. And in large part from your shows, I've learned a lot, which is one of the reasons why it's the main reason why I wanted to talk to you all today and why I'm really excited about this. Each of our shows has a really different style and tone, and each one has a different sort of approach, I feel, to the literary interview. And so I wanted to talk to you all about that, and with an eye towards exploring both the hows of interviewing and the whys of what each of us does. So to start off, if I could have each of you introduce yourself briefly, say your name and introduce your show just real quick. We'll start with Rachel.
So my name is Rachel Zucker, and I host and founded the podcast Commonplace, Conversations with Poets and Other People, although we're thinking of dropping the Conversations with Poets and Other People line. And they are long-form, lightly edited conversations between myself and artists, poets, writers, sometimes visual artists or public figures or just people that last usually between an hour and a half and 2 hours. And I'm an independent podcast. I learned to say that.
All right. How about Dujie next?
Hi, I'm Dujie Tahat with the Poet Salon, where we interview poets over a special drink we made just for them. My co-hosts are Luther Hughes and Gabrielle Bates. Yeah.
Thanks. And then David.
I'm David Naimon, host of Between the Covers. Like Commonplace, it's a long-form, lightly edited show. It's nonfiction, fiction, poetry, hybrid and indeterminate works, and science fiction and fantasy. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So
I didn't even say like the format of the show because ours is a little different. Is that worth saying?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So we had do the long form interview, medium-ish, where we interview the poet about their work. And we answer a question from our guests sort of in the first episode, and then every guest we have on for 2 episodes. The second one is much shorter. And in the second week, we specifically dive into a poem not by that person, but a poem that that poet just loves. And we just geek out about for 15 or 20 minutes or however long we're so moved.
Yeah. I actually find the question of format really interesting. For my own show, I do... I talk to artists, writers, people working in all different creative disciplines, and occasionally other podcasters, even curators. And I always split the show into 2 segments. The first segment is where I talk to my guest about their work, and occasionally, as appropriate to the work, about their bio as well. And then in the second segment, I invite the guest to bring their own topic. And I've found that format choice has really influenced the character of my show a lot, and especially because I can't really predict at all what people are going to want to talk about for the second segment, and that really informs the direction of the conversation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how each of you, what the format of your show is, and how that sort of shapes the conversation, you think. And since you were just talking about that, Dujie, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, we know what the second part of our show is going to be because we ask our guests to provide the poem ahead of time. That said, it is really heavily, I'm surprised by how often we end up pulling from our earlier conversations, whether that's like sort of in appreciation of the poet or poem they've chosen to bring in, whether that's like actually from the poem or just having had that conversation 20 or 30 minutes earlier. It's interesting to see how those 2 conversations connect. And I think just in terms of functionally how that changes our approach, it's certainly looser, that second section, because we don't know, precisely because of that. And I think we bring a similar sort of sensibility in terms of the longer section. Insofar as we obviously show up with our sort of 6 or so questions, but then there's just a lot of dialogue and follow-up after what is already set, sort of trusting that, it'll all tie together eventually.
Thank you. Okay. How about David next?
Well, first I'll just say that I like both of your format choices a lot. I think it adds a lot of fun and surprise. The second segment of Keep the Channel Open, and then the various segments of the Poet Salon. As a listener, I feel like those are really enjoyable. I guess for me, the simple long form conversation that I do, it comes down to mainly probably as a listener to podcasts, not gravitating towards ones that are super chatty, small talk oriented. I like to do deep dives into craft, which I know limits my audience probably because there's going to be people who legitimately want to listen to an author, but they don't want to talk about point of view or tense. And I know all of our shows are craft focused shows. But having that long form sort of one format for me has been useful, especially since I'm a solo host. I love, like with the Poet Salon, that you have these 3 personalities, and then you have discussions about line breaks, like in the last episode, that I don't feel like necessarily that I would do. But I guess it's a focus on depth rather than breadth in terms of accessibility and audience. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about your show. I think all 3 of you, your shows managed to get a lot of depth. So how about you, Rachel?
Well, I was going to actually add that even though David and I have a more simple format in the sense of, like no different segments, there is also the introduction, then the main conversation, and the outro, which are in a way a kind of format. And I think that even though David's show and mine are very similar, our introduction styles are somewhat different. And even though the length of our shows are very similar, I also think there's a different kind of depth. Like I think David gets into craft details much more precisely and deeply than I do. I think that the length of my episodes are not quite as much about depth, but about a kind of, getting to an emotional vulnerability that only happens once you've spent, almost 2 hours in a room with one person. So I also wanted to bring up other formatting questions that maybe are not structural as much as format, such as, I always record Commonplace face to face, although now I'm going to have to start doing remote recordings. David does face to face, but in his studio. And I think that affects, the recording as well, not just in terms of sound, but also in terms of the kind of relationship between the two people. For me, it's often quite different whether I'm recording in my living room at home. That brings all kinds of interesting kind of things into the space and into the emotional relationship, whether I'm recording in a hotel room, whether I'm recording in the artist's home. And there have been a few times where I've recorded in this sort of studio space at NYU that I really don't like. But even that has brought certain kind of things that I think, come through in the recording, like in terms of the intimacy or not intimacy. And then I was going to also say that this question of like solo host versus multiple hosts, I think is also hugely relevant as a formatting question, and also how much you edit. And even though those in some ways are different things, I think they all, when I think about format in terms of form, with my poet mind, all of these things would function to like influence the final podcast or the final episode that you hear, the same way that line breaks or the way the poem is laid out on the page, or the length of the poem, or the point of view of the poem, or the sort of style, scope, register. So, and I think that as a poet making a podcast, I am like pretty obsessed with those kinds of formal questions.
Yeah. It's interesting. These are all things that I did want to get to more. Since you brought up this question of, in person or like where you record, is one of the things that I found really interesting, to talk to all of you about. And especially, because we do all sort of record in different ways, different spaces. There's a different dynamic. Obviously, 3 of us are doing solo shows. And then with the Poet Salon, Dujie, you have 2 co-hosts. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Dujie, you do most of your recordings in person. Is that right?
Yeah, we do all of them in person.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that means I'm the only person here that primarily does remote recordings. I do in-person recordings when people are in San Diego, which is, pretty rare. It's not a town that arts and literature come to quite as much as I would like. And I find it really interesting because personally, I find in-person recordings a lot more intimidating. And I have always sort of felt that when I listen back when I'm doing the edit to an in-person one, not only are there just sort of like acoustic things that are a little annoying to deal with, but also I feel like you can kind of tell that I have a different energy in person. And I always sort of think that the guest sort of picks that up too. But I want to sort of explore this a little bit. What do we feel that these things do or don't do? I know, David, you're used to recording in a radio studio, and I know you're sort of having to deal with a bit of a transition now. So can you talk a little bit about, what do you think is really gained by that, and what are you like concerned about in the transition?
Wait, can I ask Mike? I ask you one
Sure.
quick question and interrupt David before he starts?
Yes.
You usually do remote, but you don't usually do video.
That's right.
And so right now, I'm curious to know, what do you feel? Are you the Mike of in person with the video, or are you the Mike of remote more? Does the video change it for you?
This is just something for me personally. Like, I always sort of, when I'm talking to people in person, have a little bit of like, I don't really know what to do with my eyeballs kind of thing. Which is another thing that I always, I get a little nervous about, because, I can be personally a little awkward, and I don't want that to interfere with the conversation. So it's a little bit different for me, but I'm working it out.
Okay. Sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt.
You didn't interrupt. Well, I'll just say first that the radio station as a location probably isn't like what most radio stations are like. It's an old community radio station that Ursula Le Guin called the terminally funky studios of KBOO, because they're not really updated. You kind of are walking back into time, and it's got these creaky, decrepit chairs and funky old, terrible carpeting and soundproofing on the walls that look from like 50 years ago. But people love going into it. There's a certain sort of and there's all these windows to various other rooms that you see other people doing these other radio activities, that it's not professional feeling in a good way. I think it's a third space that we're both in, that is not like sitting behind a desk in a really professional, maybe like some professional radio stations, you feel like you're in an airport almost, I think. And it's sort of charming in a really weird way for people. Maybe in some ways it's not charming for other people. But I guess I have this belief, and there's no way to prove it because we can't do the interviews twice, that if you're in the room with the person, that it's producing the two bodies being in the room together, and all the things that are communicated verbally and through gesture are informing what we're saying. And that I think there's something additive that we can't quantify in that happening. But I'll just say, to undercut that, the only interview that I've done remotely, which was with Solmaz Sharif, when she had to cancel last minute. It was a super popular interview. And likewise, one of my favorite interviews of Rachel's is with Sheila Heti and Sarah Manguso, which was done remotely. And so I could ask the question, what were lost in those interviews, but I could never answer that question. So I have this faith that I can't verify around the in-person aspect.
I think often actually around this particular question, at last year's AWP, Rachel, I saw you on a panel with Danette Smith and Franny Choi of the Versus podcast. And you made like a really lovely analogy of the sort of one-on-one as being sort of, I think, almost as a confessional room, whereas Danette and Franny had a podcast where they were sitting like in their living room, like on their couch with their guests. And I've thought about that a lot, and especially insofar as like me, Gabby, and Luther kind of have an actual sort of salon situation inadvertently. I think at first we thought it was just sort of a catchy title, but then as we've invited folks into the room and we've shifted the different places we've recorded, we initially started recording at Open Books, a Poem Emporium. It's this really tiny poetry-only bookstore in Seattle, which we all revere, and the two of them had worked at the time. And then we shifted into Gabby's dining room pretty much when she moved apartments, which is also a neat space. And I think like the physical actual location both changed and made it more salon-y. And I think, again, just the dynamics of what we're doing and, the fact that like we make them a drink, whether there's alcohol in it or not, adds to that effect.
Yeah. I'm also really interested because the other three of us, we're all solo hosts and we're all, doing a one-on-one thing. That's something that both David and Rachel just now made reference to, is this one-on-one interaction. And whereas on the Poet Salon, it's three of you in the room with your guest. And I have to imagine that, to me, it sounds very different as a listener, but I have to imagine it feels very different as well. So like, how do you feel that affects things in the conversation, Dujie?
Yeah, I think if I'm being frank, especially when I pitched doing a podcast to Gabby and Luther in the first place, I didn't feel like I was anywhere near a good enough poet or like have a strong enough mind for it, or personality even necessarily to drive a whole show. And I think in some respects it was defensive. And I knew that having the two of them who are, incredibly smart and just sort of fun to be around would add to sort of the alchemy of the show.
Well, I hope that you being published in Poetry Magazine has changed that a little bit.
Well, so there's this like really good push and pull. Thank you very much, David. I think what I will say is like, having the podcast made me a better poet, right? I think I was sort of in the process, I was calling it my DIY MFA, where I was sort of starting to interview poets anyway. And that was sort of part of the spirit within which I asked Gabby and Luther to try this wild thing. And I think just over we were 2 years into it at this point. maybe 1.5. And I've just gotten so much better at thinking about these things, just being in literal conversations. And I think I've gotten farther because I have Gabby and Luther helping come up with smarter questions, just sort of like refining my own thinking, both when we do our segment around like a specific craft element, and then just in the coming up of questions for our guests as well. Of course, all of them I am indebted to for an education that I wouldn't have gotten without them.
I've got to say, I find that pretty relatable. I mean, I'm not very widely published myself. To me, it brings up an interesting question, because when I listen to the Poet Salon, I find each of your personalities is very distinct in the conversation, and you each have a certain approach. So it's like, after listening to the show for a while, I find I expect certain kinds of questions more from one of you than the other in a way that really meshes very well. I find this question of personality and rapport with one's guests to be really interesting, because I think all four of us have a pretty distinct voice to our shows and point of view, and that informs the approach. So I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit. Like, Rachel, one of the things that I have always really admired about your show is, like, to a greater degree than anybody else that I'm familiar with, you as a person are very present in the conversation. And, there's a pretty wide range of different opinions about, what the role of the host is. Like, there's the classic sort of Terry Gross doesn't want you to know anything about her, right? Whereas somebody like Mark Maron, for example, it's like exactly the opposite. And I know for myself, that's something that I have tried to incorporate into my show to some degree or another, but it's always been very challenging for me. But so I wanted to talk to you about, like, how much of this is intentional in your show, how much of it is just sort of like you kind of can't help it, or maybe like whatever it is. I just I find it so fascinating listening to your show, and it's one of the things that I really love about your show is feeling like I am getting to know you as well as your guests.
Well, thank you for saying that. I feel like that exact thing that you said has often been a criticism of me in my work. And I guess people who don't like that about my work or don't like that in a podcast host just don't listen to the podcast, which is interesting. There's sort of like two ways I want to answer this. One is that, to go back to what Dujie said about that panel that I was on with Dinez Smith and Franny Choi and Rebecca Hoog, I did say that my podcast feels a little bit more like a confessional because Dinez was saying that their podcast feels a little more like a dinner party. And I later sort of took back the word confessional and said it feels more like therapy. And I do think that that's an important distinction. And I have been experiencing in the past few weeks what it's like to speak to my therapist over the phone, rather than in person. And she can't do the video. So it's just phone. And it is a very, very, she's still a great therapist and it's still going well, but there's something different. One thing I notice is that in person, I would say I talk 80% of the time and she talks 20. Over the phone, I would say she talks 40% of the time and I talk 60%. And I don't know if that's because she wants to make sure I know she's listening, whereas so much that happens in the room. And I was at this Creative Capital event with C.A. Conrad, genius poet, and they said that, and I don't know where the numbers came from, but they said that in terms of in-person communication, that 80% of it is nonverbal. So 80% of how communication is working when you're face-to-face is not what you're saying, but your gestures, your facial expressions, your body language and stuff like that. So I think it's a really interesting question, like not just where we feel most comfortable or where we feel most, how each of us can be our best listener. And if that's even all of our goal. But I do think that it is very intimidating for me to be in the room with the other person, to be face to face. I never quite know what to do with my body. I don't feel super comfortable with my physical appearance. I'm always very anxious about talking too much, doing this, doing that, whatever. I go over the whole thing, endlessly afterwards. Why did I say this? Why did I do that? Often I'm like, I will realize after 2 hours that I've been sitting in a way that is just killing my back, but like, why did I do that? Or I'm too embarrassed to, tell the guest, like, the sound isn't good. I need to stop you for a second. And yet having another person in the room with me, which some people do, like Dinez and Franny have their producer in the room with them. To me, that would be like someone being in the room with me while I'm in therapy, or like having sex or something. Like it just seems like so, I don't know. I mean, maybe I should try it. Some people have more than one person in the room when they have sex or therapy.
I can't imagine someone being in the room either.
Right.
Not for sex, but for the radios. That seems like that would be bizarre.
Right. And actually, the thing I was going to also say is that in addition to doing individual therapy for a lot of years with a lot of different therapists and having the experience of mostly face-to-face versus phone sessions, I also did group therapy for about 10 years. And I found that to be utterly fascinating and productive and really different from individual therapy. And so I don't think that the solo host versus multiple hosts I don't think it's a binary in terms of what is the emotional tenor or the emotional location or the level of intimacy, because I think that, I love the podcast Versus, but that podcast I think is much more like a dinner party, and Poets Salon I think is more like group therapy. I mean, I think it has elements of both. It has elements of an intimate dinner party, but there are things that happen between Luther, Gabrielle, and Dujie that feel to me more like, especially when they disagree, a little more like group therapy. And then the last thing I'll say, because I going on and on, is I definitely don't know any other way to do anything other than to be way too oversharing, or to flip that around, and to be present and to be transparent. And I know that that's something else that you wanted to talk about at some point, Mike, but I do feel like it's the emotional vulnerability or the emotional, the way in which people learn about me and the other guest. I feel both very embarrassed and ashamed about it, because I feel like why is this about me? Why isn't this about the other person? And that's a very complicated feeling that feels sometimes disrespectful when, I'm comparing something to myself. On the other hand, I think that there are certain like ethical problems in trying to be absent yourself. And the Terry Gross model has always been very troubling to me, actually. And I think that there's something, that's, I don't know. Again, I keep coming back to the therapy analogy, because I've had therapists who have shared more of their personal life with me, and I've had therapists who have been very careful about that. And I think it depends what the relationship is like in the room with the client, what's the client's dealing with, whether there's a identification, what the transference is like. And I do think that I'm using a lot of those skills. I did one semester of a PsyD program in clinical psychology before I had to drop out. That I think makes me a better host than, David, I would say, is, and I'm not saying this to be self-deprecating at all, like way smarter than I am, way more prepared, way more like, organized in his thinking. And, the fact that Dujie and Mike, you have these like different structures, like how could I even like get to the next part if I had a next structural part? I don't know. We all, I think have figured out how to do the thing that accommodates our weaknesses and our strengths.
That's a really interesting point, and to me, a lot of the things that you were saying kind of are sort of pointing me in the direction of a couple of the questions that I have here. And one is, like what the role of the host is or ought to be. And the other is, how we go about establishing rapport with our guests, because that's really sort of the key thing. If you want to get anywhere, have any kind of meaningful conversation, you have to have that sort of trust and rapport between all the people that are participating in the conversation. And, I hope this isn't revealing too much. It was in public. So, it was reminding me of this Twitter conversation I was having with David a while ago. We're talking about interview questions and the sort of length of interview questions. David was saying that he feels embarrassed sometimes because his questions are very long, or they can be. Whereas I've always found, listening to Between the Covers, it's true, like, David, your questions can be long, but they don't ever feel like self-centered or selfish to me. They feel like you're paying very close attention to the work. And so it requires sort of a more articulate question. This question of what the role of the host is and how we go about establishing that rapport with our guests is one that's very interesting to me. Would you be willing to talk about that, David?
Yeah. I don't want to talk beyond what I feel like the role is for me. There are hosts that do things that I don't do that I think are important. Like I'm not doing adversarial interviews or having guests on where I have these fundamental problems with their work. That doesn't mean I don't appreciate being a listener sometimes to an artfully done conversation with someone who's put on the spot and you go deep on questions that are more confrontational. But I guess for me, the role of the host is I want to center the guest in the universe of their own interests. And so I think when I'm doing these questions that sometimes become mini essays, they're also demonstrative that I've been doing research within their universe. Like, so I've entered their universe of curiosities and questions, and I've sort of explored around prior to us having our conversation. And so part of my question to them might also be, here's where I've gone in your world, or related to your world. Does that spark any thoughts for you about the things that you do, or is this something new? But the other thing I'd add also is, I think for me, one of my aspirations is to generate surprise, I guess. I want there to be, I don't want guests, particularly guests who are doing a lot of touring, when they go for survival, they have to go on autopilot. They have their prepared answers, and often those answers are really interesting if someone's only listening to one interview of that author. So it's not like those are bad, but it's also refreshing when your question is different enough that the guest is knocked out of their preparation. And so we arrive at a place that's unexpected and also appreciated. So not trying to spring something on them, but trying to just make it feel fresh, I guess.
I was just going to say, that's so interesting to hear, David, and the way you articulate your own sort of formulation of question, because I would say I've evolved over the time of hosting the podcast to sort of move towards your direction, because insofar as I've had sort of interview experience in my life, it is in journalism. And, early on when I was speaking to journalists about like, how do they conduct interviews, I think one of the best, most salient pieces of advice I got was to ask stupid questions, right? To like not contextualize and sort of play dumb in some ways as a way, you often get some of the best answers. And as a journalist, like, people will reveal themselves in like really interesting ways. And so that's, I think, that was the ethos I think I held close as I started the podcast. And then over time, I think listening to yours in particular, it just struck me at some point that like, that can be a really generous thing to give like such a detailed analysis, or at least, the thinking that led you to that question in the first place, that demonstrates like sort of how much, to your point, that you've sort of flung yourself into the universe of their interests, is really, really cool. And I do think that it helps generate a kind of surprise that is abundant in your interviews. I think I'm thinking of the Salon interview in particular, but so many of your guests are just like, wow, at the end of the interview, they're just like really struck. And I think that's definitely a thing that we are trying to go for as a group on the Poet Salon. I think on the Poet Salon, we have a little more flexibility insofar as I think you were alluding to earlier, Mike, we have different interests, we have different personalities and different approaches to asking questions. And so it feels, because we're sort of ping-ponging around, like that surprise is sort of inherent. And yeah, I will say just like, again, for myself, I think I've started asking more detailed questions as a sort of interesting counterweight to, sometimes we get canned answers. And I think like that for us, that's perfectly fine, right? Because I think in the mix of it all, hopefully something new emerges.
I think it's a really interesting thing. One of the things that I really love listening for in other people's shows is those moments of surprise from the guest, right? Is when you can tell that there is a genuine interaction happening. Because like David was saying, a lot of times, I mean, I'm sure that the rest of you do this as well. Whenever I'm preparing to talk to someone for Keep the Channel Open, I go and listen to like every other interview they've done in the past year. And I will read through every interview that has been in print. Because I want to know what else people are talking about. And you do see a lot of the same stuff come up over and over again. And I, partially just for selfish reasons, I don't want to just have that same conversation. I also try to think of it as, I assume the guest doesn't want to keep having the same conversation over and over again. I find that there is this thing that happens a lot on David's show where the first thing you do on your show, David, is introduce the guest. And the introduction can sometimes take several minutes where you're like reading this long list of accomplishments that they've done and all these different things that different people have said about their work. And there is this moment that often happens, not every time, but often happens where they're like, wow, that was really thorough. And you can tell that there's an appreciation there. Similarly, on Commonplace, I find that there is a moment that can happen where, Rachel, you may be sharing something about yourself personal, and there can be this little moment of genuine surprise from your guest where they're like, I didn't realize that this was that kind of conversation, but now that I know that it is, I'll go there too. And so this way of, these little moves that we do that are these little acts of generosity, I find them so integral to having a really productive conversation and establishing that level of trust with the guest. This thing too, that Dujie was just talking about, changing the kinds of questions that you're asking is something I find really interesting. For myself, I tend not to write out questions beforehand. I will have extensive notes about sort of topics that I want to talk about, but I very rarely actually work off of, a written list of questions. And that was very intentional when I was developing my show, that I didn't want to be looking at my notes too much. And I wanted to try and, respond in the moment to what people are saying. That's something that I know that I've, when Rachel and David were on Keep the Channel Open before, we talked about things like that. I'm really interested in this sort of question of how each of us prepares for a show, like whether we're working off of pre-written questions or that kind of thing, and how we each feel that preparation influences the conversation. Can we start with Dujie?
Can I interrupt again?
Sure.
I'm sorry. I want to talk about the preparation, and I really want to hear what Dujie has to say, but I just want to go back for 1 second. You said that these were acts of generosity that led to this kind of surprise or connection in the conversation. I just was really struck by that word, because I do think that it is generosity in certain ways, but I think of it so much more often as selfishness, just in terms of my own kind of method and way of thinking about this, because I do not think of myself as an interviewer at all. I do not think of Commonplace as a series of interviews. I really think of them as conversations. And I can't stand those canned answers, when someone is like on a book tour. And sometimes, the canned answers are so brilliant. It's often the most brilliant writers who have these canned answers, but that's just really not what I'm there for. I am really there selfishly for myself. These are people that have experiences, knowledge, information vulnerabilities that I desperately want to know. Like, I want to be let into their world. And so I also listen to interviews with these writers, but I'm not, and I don't like repeating the same content over and over again. But what I find is that I'm not so much listening to like, what have they talked about before, but I am listening to what kinds of questions do they always get defensive about? What kinds of questions will not lead somewhere? I'm looking to break them, basically, or I'm looking more kindly to be let in. And you can tell so much about their people's speech patterns, people's like openness. Like Maggie Nelson is a really good example. There are great interviews with Maggie, and there are interviews with Maggie where she just does not let you in at all. She is brilliant, and she can talk about, Hannah Arendt all day long, and it's moving and it's, incredible. And I love to hear her, but she will not talk about her personal life or about certain kinds of, it's not even like her personal life. It's like a certain, you have to get to her in a sideways way.
Yeah.
And sometimes, I can figure that out and beforehand, sometimes I can't, but I think I'm very, very, very much for me, I'm there for myself, and other people can listen or not, but whatever.
Can I interrupt you, Rachel?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the generosity and the selfishness are inseparable from each other. So for instance, when you're like thinking about the death of your mom, and the last place she lived was Taiwan, and you're dealing with all of these irresolvable feelings and questions about how your relationship ended. Yet the show you produce, you go to Taiwan, which of course you could say that's selfish. I'm exploring Taiwan because my mom died there. But you're also highlighting all of these Taiwanese bookmakers and centering all of these questions that are Taiwan specific that have nothing to do with your mom, but were prompted by your initial question around your mom. And similarly, questions around hysterectomy or menopause can then become about whales or so you have these like for me, I identify very much that question in my own work, and like what Dujie said, how much being a podcast host has influenced his writing. It's had a huge influence on my writing and my interests. And then I pursue those questions. I have my own writing questions or my own craft questions or my own curiosities that are beyond my comprehension that might inform the guests that I then invite onto the show. But then when the guest comes on the show, I'm centering the guest. So you could say that it's selfish that I'm having so-and-so on to try to solve a question for myself around writing. But on the other hand, it is also, I think, maybe generous at the same time.
I mean, I think that there's this interesting sort of dichotomy, or I don't know if it's a dichotomy, or I'm trying to avoid binary thinking, right? There's this question of whether it's selfish or generous. Maybe if we shift a little bit, because what this is really bringing up for me is, why do it in the first place?
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think that's sort of the big question of all of these things. And it's something that I ask myself all the time, like, why am I doing this? And there is an aspect of it that feels to me very similarly, very selfish. Like, I'm talking to people because I want to talk to them, right? Like, I want to have these conversations, and I want to be the one I'm not actually in the room with the person usually, but you get what I'm saying. Like, I want to be the one doing the talking. I don't just want to be a listener and passive. And yet, something that, I find a little embarrassing to admit, but I'm sure that this happens to each of you, that, occasionally a listener will reach out and say, like, listening to the show is something that they really love, or that has been helpful to them, or that it adds something. And that's something I find very gratifying. And it's certainly something that I hope to accomplish, but like, it's hard to separate that out, this is sort of the question with any creative process, right? Like, it's the same with, when I'm making photographs or writing an essay or a poem or something. Like, on some level, I'm doing it mainly for myself, right? But then I'm also not just putting it in a drawer, right? I'm trying to put it out into the world and do something with it. And that to me, again, can feel selfish, but also, at least for me, there is a hope that that can be of service to other people as well. I think this question of why we're doing this is really an important one. It can be very clarifying. And yeah, I'm really interested to hear what you all think about that.
If I might, I mean, just to zoom out to like sort of the moment that we're in, global pandemic notwithstanding, you know, you're seeing a lot of folks like build like mutual aid groups, right? And this idea of looking out for one another is both selfish and generous, right? And I think that in a lot of ways, you know, what prompted me to ask Gabby and Luther to start this podcast was because I was listening to poetry podcasts and I was like, I've listened to all of them or I'm caught up on all of them, you know, like why aren't there more? And frankly, like why aren't there more from people like me you know, who come from the communities I come from. And so, you know, as with respect to the question of like, why do it at all? I think at first it's that, you know, I would like to and this is maybe also a poetic approach. I would like to produce something that a previous version of myself would have really appreciated seeing or hearing or just sort of consuming at some point. That's maybe that is selfish in some ways because that is for myself, but that is also generous in some ways because, you know, that younger version of myself really, this current version of myself could really use some guidance on, you know, what to do next. And I think sort of thinking through that in a communal way. And I think that was sort of why my instinct was towards, you know, pulling in other co-hosts as well as, like I mentioned, just not being particularly ready. You know, I think the more people I can pull into it, the better the product. And then the more useful that, and by better, I mean, the more useful it can be for, you know, that same group of people who is frankly wider than I have any line of sight into.
How about Rachel?
So I think that there are a bunch of reasons that I do Commonplace, and I'm going to try to. I wish there was a way to simultaneously say them all, because to list them in any order is to imply a hierarchy. But one of the reasons that I started doing Commonplace and that I love doing it is trying to create a non-hierarchical, non-traditional mode of learning, connection, education. A lot of people listen to Commonplace as a kind of non-degree MFA, either because they can't afford it or, you know, so I feel very strongly about that. That's very important to me outside of my podcasting work as well. I think I started it because I was lonely. I think I started it because I wanted, because I thought I'd be good at it. I absolutely think the most important thing, the most important goal for me and for all the other people who work on Commonplace is to destroy white supremacy and the heteropatriarchy. Now, I know those are big goals, but that's why I'm doing it. And I have certain specific and different responsibilities as a straight white podcaster that, you know, than I might if I were of color. But if that is my goal, if that's both my internal and external goal, I have to figure out how to make sure that those other goals, which are important, feeling good at it, not being lonely, offering something for free, that, you know, being anti-capitalist, but also paying the people who work on Commonplace. Like I have to make sure that each one of those goals or each one of those reasons for doing it is honored to the extent that it can be honored, so long as it does not interfere with the larger goal, which is about dismantling white supremacy and the heteropatriarchy.
I want to come back to some of those things, but I want to hear from David too.
Well, I think I have a similar thing to Rachel around things that are very self-oriented versus things that are more focused on social justice. But I do feel like at least the initial impulse was to learn more about writing for myself. And then also then to create a space where others could learn about writing. And then from there, also a space that's promoting writing that isn't happening in the certain forms that are most common in a capitalist marketplace. Like, it's not a coincidence that you see 80-page novels in Latin America and Europe, but you don't see them in the United States, or image text, or works that refuse to accept the label memoir or novel or poetry. You don't see them as often, and they're not usually bestsellers. And so promoting and foregrounding the presses that are doing that sort of work, and then thinking about from there, foregrounding works that are in translation, because we do so little translation, and can we put forward the people who are touring for their books in another language in the United States. And then even larger than that, then I guess questions just largely around representation, which I think matters for hosts and guests, and thinking about, as I just mentioned, the aesthetic questions around representation, writing styles in schools, but also race and gender and class and nationality. And I definitely have in my mind I know in my mind, like, what are the things that I haven't done enough of in the last 2 years? Like, so that definitely informs the type of people I ask. And then that you have to take that into account with my show being in person, and it's not in New York City, it's in Portland, Oregon. So even though I might have these open questions of like, well, I want to do more of this, that doesn't necessarily happen right away. But I definitely have a sense of like things that I'm not doing well in that regard.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting thing, you know, just to say for myself, I started my show. So, you know, I talked to a lot of writers, and you know, this is the panel title, if it was going to be at AWP, was going to be the craft of the literary art, the literary interview podcast. But I actually talked to a lot of people who are non-writers, and to the extent that I have a creative practice that's known at all, it's more as a photographer than as a writer. And this for me came out of, I would go to this photography festival that's in my city, and would have these conversations with people that were like the best conversations I would have all year long. And I wanted to have more of those, cause I didn't feel like I had a creative community, people that I knew. And I have more of that now, largely because of that festival being in my town and lots of local people going there. But I think I was originally looking for connection more than anything else. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely always been an aspect for me of connection and community building, in the ways that I try to maintain contact with guests after they've been on the show. I'm not always great at that, not as good as I would like to be, but I try. But thinking, as the show has gone on, it's been a little over 4 years now, I find that I'm thinking a lot more about what the show can do, and what am I by putting this out in the world, what is it accomplishing, and what responsibilities I have. This thing that the two of you both mentioned, and where I sort of am interested in going with this is, one of the things that David mentioned was that these concerns that you have, for social issues, and I know a lot of the times you will talk to people on your show about environmental issues, informs who you have on the show. I think that this is such an interesting question of how we choose who we're going to talk to. Obviously, part of it has to do with access. Part of it has to do with, like you were saying, David, who's going to come to Portland, Oregon, who's going to talk to, a podcast at all, who's going to, but leaving the question of access aside, there is still, it's not like I invite everybody on my show that I've ever heard of, or everyone that asks to be on my show. I don't invite them all on to be on the show. So I think that this is a really interesting question of how we decide who we want to talk to.
I'll just add to that question, or maybe as an aside, that the thing that I hate the most about doing the show is the gatekeeping part. I know that's not about it is partly about the deciding, but there's definitely people who I would be happy to have on the show who are coming to Portland who would be as good as anybody I am having on, and I'm not having them on, purely based on logistics and the number of people who I have on the show in a given year, and my time for preparation, and good or bad luck around when that all intersects with my own life. So sometimes that's not taken very well, or sometimes I don't take it well. And I've had to learn over years about not feeling bad, because I started out like, at the beginning, just answering every single solicitation. And it was only a year ago that I even had figured out to have an auto reply that could filter out like the several hundred people who don't even know the people they're soliciting when they email me. Because I get all sorts of solicitations that are people who are obviously unaware of the show, who want to be on the show also. I know it's a different question than what you're asking, but for me, it's related to it because it's a stressful aspect of figuring out who I want to have on the show.
Yeah. I think the gatekeeping aspect is a really interesting one, and it's an important one. Certainly, when we think about sort of the ethical and responsibility kind of questions about being an interviewer or a podcast host or whatever we want to call ourselves, maybe we can come back to that. Because I think that it's sort of there's two sort of things here, like when we're considering one, like what those responsibilities are, but then also to not, because gatekeeping is such a necessarily fraught thing. We all only have, however many days available per year to talk to people. We only have so many episodes. So just logistically, we can't have everybody on the show. It's a sort of necessity at some point to make some kind of decisions. And that is a fraught decision to make. But then at the same time, I'm also interested in this question of we're choosing people to be on the show for a reason, because we want to accomplish something. And I think that's an interesting and important thing to consider also,
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So, Dujie, when you are, and your co-hosts are talking about who to have on the Poet Salon, what kinds of things are you thinking about? What kinds of things are guiding you in those decisions?
Yeah. Well, for us, I think even from jump, when we first started having conversations about starting a podcast, we really wanted to set some really strong constraints for us that we knew that we could achieve, because it was an experiment, because this is very part-time for all of us. So for us, we decided 10 guests per season gives us 20 weeks, 20 episodes across the first half of the year. And then we get sort of the second half of the year to begin to really plan and even start doing interviews for the next season. So that's sort of like one set of considerations. And then another one is, two of the three of us are from Washington. Gabby, lives here in Seattle. And we all feel like there's not enough love for the poets in Seattle, or that, that Seattle sort of Pacific Northwest literature is not as elevated maybe as we think it should be. And so sort of given those two things, we figured we'd like half of our guests to be from the Pacific Northwest. And then the other half are folks who are just sort of coming through, whether it be through the Seattle Arts and Lecture Series, which has been really helpful and generous in helping us book some guests, especially early on when we didn't really have a product or a list of guests to show, and readings, at the various bookstores around town. We are really lucky to have a really thriving literature scene, and most folks who are on a book tour will stop in Seattle at some point. So that's really great. I think there's a little less pressure, I feel, about sort of our guest lineup. Again, it's a little diffuse because we have so many cooks in the kitchen. I don't feel like I bear the responsibility of it. I think collectively we feel that responsibility, and we definitely want our guests to sort of reflect our interests and, again, our communities and, the stuff that we're thinking about and the work and that informs how we think and move through the world.
Rachel, you want to go next?
Sure. A lot of it has to do with luck and logistical stuff. Since I'm an adjunct at NYU and I teach in the fall, but not in the spring, I try to see if I can get, and I don't pay guests to come on the show. I don't have a budget for that. But I can usually get $150 to have someone visit my class at NYU. So if someone has a new book out, especially, and I can teach their book and I can invite them to class, and then I can record with them on Commonplace, it's a little bit like I've given them, a little bit of financial resources, to be on the podcast. And also I've enabled myself to double, to prepare for class and for the podcast. That doesn't happen that often. Sometimes I'm very lucky to be living in New York. Many, many writers come through New York. But I also try to set up recordings whenever I travel. And wherever I go, to try to do at least, one or two. But so that's the logistical part of it. But then more important than that, because there's many, 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 many more people than I have the ability to have recorded conversations with. It's very, very much about representation and, of every kind. And representation in terms of identity and positionality and subjectivity, but also in terms of content. Although I am not diverse in this, or inclusive in the sense that I am not interested in having conservatives, Republicans, any kind. I'm not interested in providing a platform for hate speech of any kind. So I don't feel compelled to, and I don't have anyone on whose work I don't like. And I don't have anyone on who, I'm not interested in their work. Maybe I know that their work, I don't want to have someone on that I don't have anything to talk about with them. But for me, I have something to talk about with a lot of people and a lot of different styles and a lot of different, so I feel very committed to not only having a really diverse group of people but people who will talk about, something that hasn't been talked about before, anarchy or anti-capitalism or the experience of getting really, really old. And also just, and this is actually a little technically tricky, but a diversity of vocal styles or differences, physical differences. So recording with Ilya Kaminsky, wanting to make sure that he was understandable to a large audience, or recording with Gerald Stern, who has Tourette's. And it was a very particularly trying day for him when I recorded with him. And so his speech tics were much worse than they usually are. And, deciding whether to run that episode, whether it was, whether it put him in an authentic light, or whether it was not that accurate and representative of his speech patterns, or talking with someone who maybe stutters. How do you deal with that? So all of those kinds of things, I think I try to think about, have we had too many people talking about the same thing? Have we had too many people from New York City? Have we had too many first book, 20-something-year-old superstars? Have we had too many? We definitely haven't had too many old people. So I try to think about that, and I keep track of my numbers, how many straight white guys have I had on Commonplace? I think 4 out of, I don't even, 85 or something. Not to say that I'm not interested in talking to them, but, I'm interested in making sure I talk to as many different kinds of people about as many different kinds of things as possible. And their work is so totally compelling. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about keeping track of who you talk to. It's something that I do as well, and I didn't know if maybe that was a weird thing to do.
It feels
I do find
awkward.
it useful. Yeah,
can I say something else that's very awkward that I probably shouldn't talk about? So of course I'm going to.
Okay.
And I would love to know, if you feel comfortable answering this, what each one of you does. I really don't know how to handle not knowing if a potential guest has a Me Too problem. And what I find is that sometimes I'll be really interested in someone's work, or, someone will recommend someone else to be on the show. And I have to be honest, it's only been with male identified people that I've come across this problem. I'm not saying it only exists with male identified people, but and then I'll sort of ask one of my friends who's a little more in the social mix, because I don't go out very much, and I'll say, does so-and-so have a Me Too problem? And they'll say, you don't know? And then I'm really stuck because, I don't want to hurt my listeners. I don't want to give a platform to people who are actively or have in the past really hurt other people. But I also don't want to go on gossip, and I don't want to, I'm not an investigative journalist. And if I were, I wouldn't be doing, insider profiles of these people. So I'm trying to figure out what my responsibility as the host is in terms of how much poking around do I do? Because again, I do think it is my responsibility, if I have someone on the show and then it turns out that they've, everybody but me knew that they were a real bad character. I don't want that. I don't know. Has this been a problem for any of you?
Go ahead, David.
I don't do any poking around, but I was scheduled to interview Mark Weiner, the guy who created Mad Men.
Yeah.
And he had his book come out. And I do a lot of preparation, like maybe 30, 35, 40 hours for an episode. I was all prepared for that one. And I had a lot of questions about the book that he wrote because it was about an older, wealthy man who lived in a high rise who is attracted. No, wait, actually, it's about his daughter is attracted to a construction worker in his high rise, and it's sort of a detective story, but there's a lot of sexualized violence, and I wasn't really clear where he was positioned in relationship to it. And I know there was a lot of questions about Mad Men and the role of women in Mad Men, and so I had a lot of questions I was going to ask around misogyny and feminism in relationship to his book and his TV series. And I wasn't clear where he was in relationship to that. But about a week before he was supposed to show up, the accusations came out from Kater Gordon, one of the writers who was dismissed the year after she made an accusation that he had asked to see her naked late in the office, that he deserved to see her naked late in the office when they were working alone. And I decided I think someone could have decided to continue with the interview, to fold in those accusations into this conversation and still have the interview. I just don't know that I was the person who could do that well. And so I decided my role in it was to not interview him. And that actually, not because I advocated for it, it actually became part of the news. I was contacted by NPR and I was in the newspaper in Seattle, but it wasn't because I canceled with him and then went out and contacted news people. That wasn't the motivation behind it. But it was weird. I didn't know. I was well, I don't know that this happened or didn't happen. But I felt doubly weird because it felt like I had the gut feeling that it didn't feel super examined in his own writing, that it was there, but he wasn't in control of it and couldn't see what he was doing. That was my gut feeling, but I don't know that. I think I made the right decision for myself, but I can imagine someone else skillfully having that conversation. And I was also supposed to be on stage with him at Powell's, which made it more complicated, but that's the only time I've ever had to think about that. But I don't think that I've ever really looked. It's interesting to look into a person's, what would be the line that would be crossed where you wouldn't have someone on, would be an interesting conversation also.
I think, it is something that I think is interesting. I have never had to cancel an interview because of something like that. The thing that is more come up for me is like whether like a question that I've never quite settled is like if someone, one of my guests subsequently, like after I had already released the episode, if it had turned out that something came out about them, like would I go back and scrub the episode? Would I like add a new intro to it to talk about it? David, I think the thing that you were talking about just now also speaks to something you were talking about before, which is that you don't really want to be having adversarial interviews with people, which is something for me as well. I don't want to, like, in general, I'm not picking people to talk to if I feel like I want to argue with them. And I have felt that, you know, there are things you can tell about people by the work, which I know is like a slippery thing. It's not something that's definitive. But there are times when there have been things in the work that I'm like, I don't, this makes me feel uncomfortable. And so maybe I'm not going to ask this person. That has happened to me before. So like those people obviously ended up not, like I didn't invite them on the show. It's not that I do like a lot of like background checking or digging, but I do try to keep my ear to the ground. You know, like it is something that, it's never really come up. Like I haven't ever uncovered anything about people, but I do, you know, I try to keep my ear to the ground, at least like seeing what conversations are being had about a person kind of thing. And like seeing, you know, like, especially because a lot of the people that I talk to on the show, I'll learn about their work because it was recommended to me by somebody else, you know? And I know that's also not a perfect sort of screening mechanism, but my hope is that the sort of the preponderance of different ways that I'm paying attention to these things is at least, you know, trying to address some level of my responsibility with these things. Because I do agree with you, Rachel, that I don't want to be responsible for for my show hurting other people, and that it's something that I do spend a lot of time thinking about. Yeah. What about you, Dujie? Is this something that you have thought much about or had to deal with on your show?
Yeah, I mean, I think, have the benefit of being the shortest running podcast of the four of us. And so we just have had fewer opportunities, I think, to have this conversation. But it is interesting to me how much of a editorial conversation those have become. One thing, I mean, we have had, that is not to say we have not had the conversation. And I think this is where having a diffuse sort of set of responsibilities and network of people and, you know, poetry social circles is helpful, just because so much of this operates with, you know, whisper networks. So to that effect, you know, again, I rely on my co-host for a lot of things. This is one of them. I do think it is, we also, I think, acknowledge that it might happen. You know, it's like, it's a very real possibility that someone we've already interviewed and that has been published, that we will and we will have to reckon with, I think, our own role in that. So I think for us, none of us believe that the position that we've staked out, to the extent that we've staked one out, is done or complete, right? I think it is very much ongoing for all of us. This project is alive, and how we choose to sort of respond to changing circumstances is a thing that we're, I think, constantly in conversation about.
Now, I was thinking of when you were saying, Mike, that what would you do about people you've already had on the show, and would you go back and change the episode? Like, I could think back and say, like, I interviewed Junot Diaz maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And then more recently, when I had Therese Marie Mayat on the show about her book, Heartberries, much of the introduction was written by Sherman Alexie. A lot of the great press was by Sherman Alexie, which she's all removed from her book since then. But a lot of my introduction about her came through his words. Should I go back and take that out? I'm not saying there's a right answer, but, you know, there's the question. And then I guess with Junot Diaz, I feel like because our conversation was so centered already on questions of sexism and questions of representation of women and the male gaze, I don't feel like there's harm happening from people listening to that conversation necessarily. I mean, maybe I'm not the right person to answer that, but I also wonder about the value of leaving things as artifacts of when they happened. Like, I don't know. I mean, I can see the value in going back through everything and putting qualifiers, but I also wonder about to what level one should do that.
Yeah. On this note, I'm often reminded of a Wesley Morris idea where he was writing, an essay sort of around similar things. I think he was using Bill Cosby as a particular reference. And, I think his thesis was ultimately that the cultural legacy that artists leave belong to all of us, and that it is, how we interact with it that matters to, I think, it was a kind of an argument against cancel culture in some ways, because I guess it would, less so much that it shouldn't happen, and more like that isn't a necessary enough conversation, or that is not a necessary enough move. Right. What we have to do is grapple with the ways that their work has affected us individually, as a community, as a people. And that's where, I think we were getting into, to David's point, there is some value in leaving it as it is, obviously sort of being attuned to and understanding the ways that as it does as it is harm other people. In what ways does it then need to be qualified to sort of minimize that? And all fascinating questions, right?
I mean, you said, Mike, that sometimes you can tell if the work makes you uncomfortable. And I think I know what you mean by that. But at the same time, I was thinking, but I love work that makes me uncomfortable, even in those kinds of ways. I was thinking about how much gender plays into that. And I'm confused about whether that's okay or not okay, or what to do about that. I mean, thinking about Ariana Reigns or Chris Kraus, if those books had been written by men, I think I might have a different feeling about the ways in which those books are really compellingly provocative and disturbing to me in certain ways. And I'm trying to think of other examples. They're sort of slipping my mind right now, but so that's also, I don't know. I don't want to shy away from work that is that either the work or the way someone lives, that I am the moral judge of that. I mean, I think that's, not so long ago, people were saying if someone was queer, that they didn't want to have that person, there was something deviant about that person. I mean, I couldn't feel less aligned with that kind of thinking. And I wonder if, to me, the line is clear. It's about consent or not consent. So anybody can do whatever they want as long as it's with someone else who's consensual, and it's consensual. But, that's a moral judgment on my part. And I wonder to what extent I am locked into a certain kind of generational moral judgment. And the other thing I'll say about this is that I do also feel that it might be different for me, or some of these questions might be different for me as a female podcast host. I think we all have responsibilities and concerns about it, but there's also a slight question for me, in part because I have always done these face to face and always alone. There have been moments where I feel a bit strange being alone in the room with a man that I don't know, that there's a lot of gossip about. There's a lot of rumors, not because I feel that, something's going to happen to me, but because that is a very deep kind of learned anxiety that I have about being alone with men, about being alone, without knowing who I'm with. And, but then again, there's all kinds of weird, I feel awkward about those kinds of worries sometimes. And so anyway, it's something that I really haven't figured out and that I'm not quite sure what to do about. And I sort of have been thinking about trying to have an advisory board for Commonplace, but I don't even know what that looks like or who that is or how that functions,
Yeah. I mean, obviously the rest of us can't comment directly on things, the gender aspect of that. But, what I would say is that even if I can't directly, I haven't experienced that anxiety myself, I will say that, you know, like as a person of color, that sometimes being in the room or even on a remote conversation with a white person, I do have, I think a similar, I'm not saying that it's the same, but I think that there is a similar anxiety that can happen for me, even like, you know, with my therapist who is a white lady, like the first few sessions, I was a little nervous about what kinds of things I can and can't say.
Yeah.
I think that for me, and there, I want to touch on something that Dujie was talking about too. There's something I think really, when one comes from a marginalized community, I think that there can be an aspect of, that it can be an exercise of power to reclaim an artistic object. I'm thinking, for example, there was an essay that Nicole Chung wrote, I think a year or two ago, maybe a little longer ago, where she was talking about a book of essays by E.B. White. And she says in the essay that I'm sure that E.B. White wasn't thinking about an adopted Korean American girl when he was writing about sailboats, but I'm choosing to take that. That is something that I can choose to do. And I found that such an interesting idea. One of the things that this is bringing up for me, though, is it sort of comes back to this question of the role of the podcast host, because I feel for myself, at least, and obviously I can't speak for how anybody else ought to do things, that there is some difference. Obviously it's intertwined, but there's some separation between me as artist, me as audience, and me as interviewer that I also oftentimes have, you know, when I'm an audience member, I might want to, I can find great value, as you were saying, Rachel, in experiencing art that is challenging and in what that does for me and what it brings to my understanding of the world by putting myself into that position as an audience member. But I think that there is a little bit of a different question when it comes to like, who am I giving a platform to? Part of it for me comes down to the fact that as a podcaster, one of the things I think constantly about as a podcaster is the power dynamics in the relationship. For me, and I think that the rest of you three are like this as well, but certainly it is not true for all interviewers and hosts. I think that the four of us are doing as much as we can to try and center the guest in the conversation, to try and give them opportunities to express themselves and to, not be making it entirely about ourselves. And I think that, giving people space to do that can be a really powerful tool, but it also comes with a certain responsibility. And that for me is sort of the dividing line, like where I may not be critical of a person for making the work that they make. I may think that the work that they make is important in one way or another, even just for the conversations that it sparks. But like, am I the right person to be having this person on my show? Like, is this something that I need to do? And I don't always know that I am. I think that there are ways in which I'm often more interested in seeing like, what can I, it's not just that I want to have conversations with people who I already agree with necessarily. It's not just that I want to limit my conversations to conversations that won't be uncomfortable, because there are times when I've talked to people and there has been a level of discomfort. But I'm always trying to figure out like, what is that discomfort in service of? For me, that's what the question is. You know what I mean?
I think you said something that helped me a lot, which is, yeah, okay, I make a lot of jokes about how I'm really selfish and I don't do as good a job centering the guest and all these things. And those things are true. But even if I talk too much, the truth is I don't even know how many hours and I don't even know how much money per episode promoting this other person's work and trying, at every stage of the way to represent this person thoughtfully, accurately, respectfully, generously in every social media kind of presentation to make sure that I feel like, that people have a context for understanding, the importance of this person. And almost always this person is from a marginalized group of some kind, or writing in a marginalized genre, or both. A person who maybe has very, very few, kind of followers, outside of the small cult world of, real professional poets, which is not even a thing. So I think that to be a podcast host is really to be of service. It is an act of literary citizenship. It is a position of, you have a lot of responsibility, and you have a lot of sort of like public facing, I cannot use the word celebrity because that is just not true, by any stretch of the imagination. But really what you're doing is listening. You're really not talking. I mean, if you're talking, it's about making connections. If you are promoting your podcast, it's really about promoting the other person's work. None of us are getting rich off of this. None of us are getting famous off of this. None of us, I mean, I think the reason why we do it is because we love this work, and we want to like make connections between these people who like, I just know that more people would love to read this work that's considered so difficult, or so, not fit for a general audience, or, even if it's my poetry MFA students, that they're going to have an opportunity to listen to to listen to Norbesi Philip talk for an hour and a half. Like, I mean, I don't know. So that I think helping me remember that it is really an act of service. It's not a performance of self, even if I talk too much.
Just one thing that I think makes Commonplace unique, and why I like that Rachel inserts herself and we learn about Rachel when she's talking to other people, is because she's a very accomplished poet in her own right, but more so as a writer than any of us are in our careers. And I feel like, some of the guests she has on are debut writers, and she's published way more than those writers. And some of the guests are her own inspirations, or her own mother figure mentors in the poetry world, whether that be Alice Notley or Bernadette Mayer. And so we get both sides. Like, she positions herself differently when she's interviewing Danez Smith than when she's interviewing Alice Notley, I'm guessing. But it's interesting to know that the person interviewing these people is someone who has a long history of books, of working under Brenda Hillman and Jory Graham. So for me, I want Rachel to insert herself in those interviews, and it doesn't feel selfish. It feels kind of like when we go back to the therapist dynamic. For me, it's more honest if the therapist is transparent about their own lived experience in a way that's relevant to the person they're listening to. So the whole notion of them being objective and blank feels false out the gate. And so, not that the therapist should be giving you these long anecdotes, but perhaps these condensed glimpses of themselves that know why they're in the room and how they're in the room. I don't know if this is I don't even know if we're still on the right question, but I'll just say that it doesn't feel selfish when Rachel is, particularly when Rachel is bringing herself into the room, for me.
I appreciate you saying that, but I think it's total bullshit. Like, first of all, I don't think that I'm just saying, I have no fucking idea what I'm doing. I don't understand. When I'm in the room, when I recorded with Morgan Parker. She had one book out at that time. She's Morgan Parker. I mean, holy shit. I don't know. I think I feel like equally like starstruck and idiotic, and maybe that's just who I am. And I find it hilarious that you have some kind of like expert like notion of me, you know, like when Dujie said, like, you know, that if you ask stupid questions, you're likely to get, like, I'm so good at that. Like, no matter how many books I've written, I feel like I just literally don't know anything. It's just astonishing to me. And I do think that that's, I don't know. I think each one of you has your own, just like we all do, have your own baggage around, like, who am I to talk to this person? Who am I, you know, to run this podcast? Who, you know, I'm more of a photographer than I am a poet, or, you know, a writer, or, you know, nobody knows who I am, or, well, there's three of us. So that sort of protects me because, you know, then I don't have to, you know, carry the whole show for myself because I don't know. I just think that people are fascinating. Everyone is so fucked up and crazy and interesting. And like, I mean, I tried to get at Mike when he interviewed me. I was trying to get him to say all kinds of stuff, you know, not even consciously, but like, it's the stuff about Mike that, you know, that he's insecure about, that I, you know, want to just like hear about all day and all night. You know, but I don't know. I guess I just feel like I've worked this problem out for myself by deciding I don't know anything and nobody knows anything. But each one of you, I guess, whatever your hesitations are, and I think those hesitations are important, and I think that they make each one of us, you know, kind of not Mark Maron, who I think my show is actually the most like Mark Maron, but, you know, he's sort of a problematically huge ego. But I think that, like, whatever your hesitations are, you're still making these podcasts. So something is giving you permission to do it. And the thing that you attribute to me as the thing that, like, maybe gives me permission to be more personal, I don't think that's real.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree. Like, when it's interesting that you mentioned Morgan Parker, because I feel like people like Morgan Parker or Tommy Pico or Dinesh Smith, who are so dynamic. And so, I mean, I would even say with some of them, amazing, like the way they move in the world. Like, when we're talking about being in person with people, like gestures, fashion, delivery, humor, like gravitas, they're intimidating to me. It doesn't matter how many doesn't matter how many books they have. It makes me feel like I'm like, oh my God, I am so square. And I think about how, like, you know, how unpopular I was in junior high school, and I'm sure they were too. But I'm thinking, like, they seem like the cool kids in school, like, and so, like, that has nothing to do with whether they have one book or 20 books.
Right.
I saw you, what was that expression you just had, Rachel Zucker? What was that?
See, this is what's so dangerous. I was developing a whole philosophy of how we each came to be sort of messed up in exactly the way in which each one of us is messed up. And I was thinking about, you know, Morgan, this is public information, was very depressed as a young person. I mean, she writes about this, and I think felt incredibly alone because of that. Tommy, for a lot of reasons, you know, including the fact that he was overweight at one point, you know, I was going through all the examples that you said, and I was thinking about them in sort of psychological terms, and thinking also about how some people present with an enormous amount of confidence, an enormous amount of, like, you know, like Robin Cost-Lewis. I mean, I love Robin so much. And, like, she was my student. And she has one book. So in some ways, like, you would think I had the power in the room. I did not have the power in the room by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, Robin is a fucking genius. And I was just like, but I think that, you know, Robin also presents with so much openness and receptivity. And there are people who are very young and have, had very sort of difficult lives who somehow, seem like a frightened, like they're going to break if you ask them a question. And then there's other people who just really have a lot of either defenses or a lot of professionalism or a lot of like, boundaries. And I was thinking about that too. Like part of it is about lived experience, a cultural background, class, race, all of these kinds of things that, I have a lot of privilege that makes me able to feel like a fool and keep doing stuff and keep being public. A lot of that comes from my educational privilege, my geographical privilege, my class privilege, like so much of that confidence, comes from that. So I don't know. I had like a million different thoughts at once that I was like, ah! And then of course the thought I always have is, oh my God, shut up. You're talking too much.
Well, sorry to put you on the spot.
So I think, for me, this is bringing up this is something that I did want to sort of get to, and which I mentioned before, this question of power dynamics in the interview. Because it's one that I think a lot about. And for me, one of the more challenging aspects of interviewing or conversation or whatever you want to call it is how to manage that, how to navigate talking to people across a difference. And, for example, Rachel, you were just talking about, you used the word privilege, right? So like something that I think a lot about is like, what is my position relative to the person that I'm talking to? Like I'm I'm a man, I'm American, I'm, relatively affluent, and I'm well educated. I'm not white. So that's one thing. But like all of these things, like, for me, it's always a question of like, how am I going to best take care of the person that I'm talking to? Cause that's sort of how I approach it. But I want to know for the rest of you, like, how do you approach this challenge, if you even see it as a challenge, to talk to people across difference, to be without being disrespectful, without, stepping in it, while maintaining empathy, and mostly like how to not let that get in the way of having a good conversation, we haven't heard from Dujie in a while. Let's go to you.
No worries. I just realized like I got into just listening to, I've heard your guys' voices so much at this point in my life. It just became like I was listening and forgot that I was actually in the conversation for a sec. Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's always an interesting question, right? I think so much of the conversations we're having, it just feels like the type of podcast conversation only poets could have. But, in terms of, I think, interviewing across difference, I think about to what end. And I think Alexander Chi wrote an essay about this, and I was lucky enough to hear him sort of say this at Breadloaf last year. I think to the extent that I myself find myself interviewing someone who is inevitably different than me, and I'm asking questions in a ham-handed way to sort of get at some of that difference, I think it is always important to sort of like, root myself in like, what's the purpose of this? And I think where you ended the question, Mike, is sort of where we start, right? Like, I want to have a great conversation, one where I learn, and hopefully have fun along the way. That is not to say that I'm not interested in being challenged or pushed, and all of those things that I think hopefully come along the way and are part of that ultimate goal. But I think that ends up being the way I approach even crafting conversations. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of sort of internal pre-work that has to happen to ensure that when it is finally expressed, like with the other person that you're interviewing, that as much as possible, you sort of like work that stuff out. And then the question can be sort of on the merits of like what their obsessions are. And I think the phrase that David used really, really early on is going to be really useful in my thinking, is just like centering them in the universe of their interests, right? I think if the point of interviewing someone across difference is to prove that you can interview someone across difference, then that's just going to be like a pretty boring conversation that probably won't illuminate much. But if that interview, if sort of crossing that difference means, literally inhabiting that like universe of interests that you certainly like cannot have the same understanding of, and sort of trying to find where your interpretation of that lives alongside what that person, I think like that's sort of like the beginnings, like that's where the juice is and that's where the interesting thing happens. But I think there's like just a ton of like personal work that has to happen before you get there.
Yeah, that's a good point. David, one of the things that I remember talking to you about on Twitter at one point was that I had expressed an anxiety about like asking a question and then having the person, having that sort of J. Alfred Prufrock moment of like, no, that's not it. That's not it at all. And you kind of chimed in and said, but that could lead to an interesting conversation too. So I'm interested in hearing you talk about this a little bit too.
Can I just add one thing to what Dujie said first?
Mm-hmm.
You sure?
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to I was just thinking back to one of my strategies, I guess, around, I don't know if it's a strategy, but around this question about writing or interviewing across difference. One of my through lines in my show is my interest in this question about writing across difference. And I remember early on in the podcast when I interviewed Claudia Rankin, and we were talking about the racial imaginary, which Rachel Zucker has a piece in, but also just talking about the idea that she had, or the question she had, of why white people, when they write about race, so rarely stay in their own bodies, that they're always imagining themselves in other bodies when they're writing their fictions about race. And that's just something that over and over again I've posed to different writers. And so there's a part of me that has this desire to be with people who are really different than me, to talk about art making and their own personal views about imagining the other or not imagining the other. So like to take Claudia Rankin's views and present them to Zadie Smith, who had just written this amazing piece in the New York Review of Books called Fascinated to Presume, which was her defense of the people who are always going into other lives and animating them with their imaginations, including her. And then that conversation went a very different way than I imagined it would go based on that essay. And I feel like that's self-generating for me because I'm interested in it around my own questions. Again, back to like self-oriented writing questions of, well, why do I decide to leave my own identity when I do? And are they good reasons when I'm choosing to? So I guess I just wanted to add that in there. There's a way, I think, to take the question and make it part of the interview in a way.
Yeah. So, Rachel, we brought this question up when we had a break just a minute ago, and you had a really interesting comment that I wanted to follow up on, which was that for you, a lot of times the thing that gets the most challenging is when you actually have something in common with the person you're talking to. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that a little more and unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So let me back up just for 1 second, which is listening to all three of you is so fascinating. And I was thinking about the word difference. I mean, I guess I know because I have been raised in an incredibly racist, patriarchal society that I have racist, internalized misogyny, like all sorts of problematic ways of talking about the world. And yet I also know myself that I can't be separated from those beliefs that I've, been surrounded by my whole life. And it's very hard to imagine something outside of those constructs. But I know that I'm not saying like, oh, in my heart, I'm pure. That's bullshit. What I am saying is that I don't actually believe that there's anything other than difference. Like, and obviously different differences are different, and have different effects. And that's what we're talking about. I think we're sort of conflating difference with privilege or difference with power. But difference is, they're really, am I the same as, anyone? No. Do I presume or believe that I can understand anyone's motivations, anyone's deep desires, anyone's inner soul? No, I don't. And I think that the place that I get into trouble, is when I have a moment of kind of like identification, which is a similarity, not same. I'm not the same as anyone. Like, even when my babies were, had just like come out of my body, they were different. They were just other. They were like, everyone is other. There's Doreen Wang, who's one of the producers on Commonplace, wants me to cut that phrase. I talked about this in the beginning, conversations with poets and other people, because for her, it brings up the being othered, and a kind of like, discomfort, and the way in which, to be othered is to be, either looked down upon or to be discriminated against. And I guess for me, the initial impetus for that phrase was like, everyone is another person than me. Like, I don't write persona poems. I don't write in the voices of other people. Maybe I will one day, but I've never been able to. Occasionally, I can write about myself in third person, but that is not actually a different person. That's just me. And so I think that all of this is like bound up together for me, this sort of philosophy of like, I think that writing, I think that podcasting, I think that like, all of my relationships with other people on some level are about like a kind of fundamental love of other human beings and a fundamental anxiety that like nobody really exists. And I'm not even sure I exist. And, and what it means to be always in self-other. Always, whatever someone else is bringing to the table, just the fact that this is another human being with an interiority that I cannot access. I can only get close. I can only try. I can only listen. I can only be next to, be sort of with, but I don't actually believe that people can really know each other, or assume to know each other. So that's like a whole philosophical way of talking about the problem that I sometimes have, which is I think that when there are differences that are more explicit or, more visible in the room or more palpable, or, someone comes from another country and, or just like loved their mother so much. She was their best friend, like that's a big difference for me. When there's something like that, my curiosity makes me a better listener and more attentive and less judgmental and more aware of my audience, because that curiosity is going to make me more careful. When I was speaking with Darcy Stanky, I was trying to talk about cutting down the binary between fertile and infertile in terms of menopause as a line that separates fertility and post-fertility, because I was trying to talk about the ways in which the patriarchy has used fertility as a measure to control women and value women, and that I wanted to talk about fertility as a concept that had to do with creativity, that had to do with leadership, that had to do not with reproduction. But one of my listeners really felt that the two of us were talking about, and I think it was when we were talking about being mothers, because both of us do have biological children, I think that we were using a kind of shorthand, familiarity, similarity, metaphors, way of communicating around something that was intended to break down a binary that's been extremely hurtful to women. And instead, we perpetuated that. And we, unintentionally perpetuated these ideas about fertility and infertility in a way that really alienated and hurt one of my listeners, and felt like I was saying that women who have not had children, for whatever reason, are somehow less a part of womanhood. So I think, and I've had like slightly similar problems before. Either could be when I know someone very, very well, or when I share something very important with them. I think the less strange a person appears to be to me, the less unlike me, sometimes the less attentive and careful I am. And I think that can be hurtful.
This thing that you just said about a shorthand is really interesting to me. And I think one of the things it gets at for me here is, I certainly don't want to minimize the experience that your listener that contacted you is having, because that's a real thing. And being mindful of that kind of thing is or should be, or maybe, I don't know what the right word is, part of one's responsibility as a host. Sure. But I think what's interesting here is that I think, I listened to that episode, and without taking anything away from a listener that might have had a different experience, it seems to me that the two of you in the room had an understanding, and because you had that shorthand available to you. And to me, this brings up a really interesting question of especially because the three of you are always recording in person. And I think all four of us have a more conversational style. I think maybe David has a style that is closest to a traditional interview, but all of us have a style that is, really about making connections with people. This question about, to what extent are we making an experience that's just between ourselves and our guest? And to what extent are we making an experience that is outward facing, that is facing the people outside of the room? I think that's a really interesting question, and how we address that, how we allow that to come into the conversation is an interesting question as a podcast host. So, David, do you have any thoughts about that?
I confess that I don't know that I'm thinking about the audience. Yeah, I feel like I'm thinking about me and the guest in the room, and hoping and trusting that there might be somebody interested in listening in. I don't know that I'm super aware of an audience.
Yeah, I think that's probably in the moment. That's probably true of all of us in one way or another. Now, for myself, I am trying to pay the most attention to the person I'm talking to. But there will be times when I, even just as a technical matter, just saying, interrupting someone when, because I'm remote, right? Or if I'm in person, let's say a plane goes overhead and I say, I have to stop the person and say, I'm going to need you to repeat what you just said. To me, that's very difficult to do, because I wouldn't do that in a normal conversation, right? But I'm thinking about the recording.
Well, what about, Dujie? I'm going to jump in, because I had a question for Dujie around this also. Given that a chunk of your guests are regional, Pacific Northwest, do you think of yourself as addressing the region? Is there a consciousness around literary community that is bioregional that you're thinking of when you're talking to a guest who happens to be from Seattle or Bellingham or Portland?
I don't know that it is overt or deliberate. I think we also, especially when we started, didn't think much of an audience as much beyond ourselves. I do think that it does end up sort of cropping up. I think it turns out, unsurprisingly, that we have regional interests, right? That we have our own sort of how how does my body live in relation to the city I stay in and the region I grew up in or the place that I moved to? And those questions do come up fairly often, especially when we interview guests who are here within Seattle. Or, we got a chance to interview Tatum Bambrick, who grew up in Ellensburg and lived in Yakima, which is like the little tiny town in Eastern Washington that I grew up with. But we didn't, know each other, but we knew mutual people. And we were able to sort of piece together a sense of rural poetics just because of the geography of where we're at. So I guess it affects our conversations in that way. To the extent of audience, I don't know, and I don't think so. But we are fairly active literary citizens, I think all three of us, both within our town and whatever other communities that we have been fortunate enough to be a part of. And so I think to the extent, again, that we do think about audience, it is that, right? We are grounded and rooted in and have a vested interest in building the literary community here in Seattle. And so while it may not be deliberate in the crafting of our questions necessarily, it's not like we, go about saying all right, we've got 5 guests who are from the Pacific Northwest. Every one of those interviews should have 2 questions about Seattle.
Right.
But over the course of being in that kind of proximity and that kind of thinking together in the way that we want to be part of the poetry community here, I think that just sort of inevitably seeps in. And I think that is, another facet of that audience question, right? It is just who are we bringing into the room in that conversation? I think that is ultimately maybe our audience, if I tried to answer that question.
Have any of you recorded with a loved one, a significant other, child, partner, lover, not for your podcast, but have you had the experience of recording? Even when David earlier said that it was disorienting to him not to be able to hear his own voice. I'm thinking about the way in which, on the one hand, I don't really think about the audience when I'm in the room. I'm really just thinking about the other person. On the other hand, even just the technical stuff of hearing my own voice or of knowing that I'm recording this, that I'm making something, makes it not a conversation, even as much as I want to have it seem like a conversation, have it seem natural, have it seem authentic. I recorded a phone conversation with my father the other day, and I could catch myself thinking oh, that's good. That's good. Oh, that sounds good. That's so smart. Or, oh, I gotcha, or whatever it was. And I think that the idea that there is an audience is something I think that is actually really critical to what we're doing, even if we're not in the moment thinking of them. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think about that all the time. I think the fact that there is an audience at all, I think, is the gig, right? It isn't just a conversation among friends. It is, designed to be a sort of product that someone else consumes. I mean, I don't think that it is entirely different than me recording my kids when they do something cute, or having them do it again so that I can record it, whether I end up sharing it or not. That is a sort of where the interesting sort of set of questions come. Then I think that's where sort of the ethics of it happen. But in terms of informing, I think the actual conversation, the fact that there's an audience at all, there's whatever that quantum physics observer effect is that. I feel that very strongly in our conversations. And, I don't think I ever answered one of the early questions of how do you build rapport, but one of the things is I sort of start recording and we just do our normal, just roundabout set of conversations. And then I inform everyone, hey, is it okay if we record the rest of this conversation? We've been recording for the last 20 minutes. And in some ways, I think that both puts its finger right on the thing and then also sort of disrupts the heightened maybe anxiety or nervousness that knowing that there's an observer might bring.
I haven't personally ever recorded with someone from my personal life before. The closest I've gotten is that a few of my friends are people who have now published. And so I've had them on the show. That has been a very interesting experience for me. And I do feel like there is something more presentational about that experience than when I'm just talking to them in person, or on Twitter or whatever. So yeah, I definitely think that it definitely changes something about the experience for sure.
I agree with all of you. You're all very smart.
Well, listen, I want to thank the three of you so much for taking the time and such a long time talking with me and with each other about this. I really appreciate your time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Did you record this?
Yeah. Okay. That was such an honor and so much fun, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. As I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes to David's show Between the Covers, Dujie's show The Poet Salon, and Rachel's show Commonplace. If you enjoy Keep the Channel Open, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, I am pretty sure you will love their shows as well, so do check those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me. The music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. You can find all of the show's social media information, transcripts, email newsletter, and show notes at keepthechanneleopen.com. We'll be back on April 23rd with a new conversation, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.